This is the largest left forum in its history. Last year we had 1,500 advance registrations. This year we have 2,600 advance registrations. We have over 400 panels and 1,400 speakers. We expect that by the time we do all of the calculations for this conference, we will have had close to 4,000 people here. It's my pleasure to begin with to welcome Chris Malone, who is a political science professor at Pace University, to give the greeting from Pace to this conference.
Good evening, everybody. I hope you're doing well. I am Christopher Malone. I'm the chair of the Department of Political Science here, and on behalf of the entire Pace community, I want to welcome you. I'm not going to take up too much of your time. You didn't come to listen to me speak. I'm looking forward to the discussion tonight. What I will say is that about 4 years ago, when I got a call from my doctoral mentor and my dear friend Francis Fox Piven, who I think is here somewhere in the audience, saying that the Left Forum needed a new home, and would I help in bringing the Left Forum to Pace University? Well, obviously, I jumped at that opportunity. My good friend and colleague Roger Salerno, a bunch of other faculty here, Megan and Nyack, Satish Kalori, Marianne Murphy, Sangeeta Rao, so many others, took that opportunity and we ran with it. And it's 4 years later, and I'm so proud that we still are the host of this event, and let's hope that it goes on for another 40 or 400 years into the future. But I do want to say that the Left Forum should be congratulated as well, because I think that Stanley and Fran and Seth and all the members of the Left Forum somehow knew that within four short years, the most important social movement of our lifetime was happening just 3 blocks from here. So congratulations on your precious Stanley. It's been an amazing 6 months here at Pace. There have been dozens of our students who have been down to Zuccotti Park. We've had teach-ins. Our faculty are doing scholarship around Occupy Wall Street. And it's been a very exciting time. And we have the Left Forum as well. And this is just a great addition to all of that. So on behalf of the entire community, I want to thank the special events folks here, Allison Sakaris. I want to thank the President, Steve Friedman, Harriet Feldman, our Provost, our Dean, Nira Herman, who can't be with us tonight. I hope you all have a great weekend. I know it'll be a great weekend, and let the festivities begin. Thank you.
I'd like to now thank the hundreds of volunteers that participated in the planning and the execution of this conference. The Left Forum planning and execution activity takes place at the CUNY Graduate Center in my office. And aside from pretzels and Twizzlers, which are my payment for renting the office. That's the rent. They have to bring pretzels. I have been absolutely amazed by the work and by the dedication of the volunteers who have both appeared at the office and have worked in the field to secure this kind of attendance. This weekend we're going to have trade unionists, and we're going to have people from the Black Freedom Movement, and we're going to have people from the Occupy movement, not only speaking but participating from the floor. We're going to have people from the feminist movement, and that didn't happen automatically. That didn't happen simply because there was a spontaneous outpouring. I wish it were true, but it's not true. It takes organizing, and one of the things that we have to say is that our volunteers are the heart of the organizing. Of course, have an indefatigable, I pronounced it correctly, it's always the first time that I've ever really truly pronounced it correctly. The indefatigable, there it is again. Seth Adler, the coordinator, spent day after day after day, and he is the only full-timer for this conference and for its preparation. He is overworked and underpaid, but that is what movement activity is all about. If we ever achieve any degree of respectability, that's the time to close shop. Anyway, I want to then now introduce the members of the Left Forum Board, who I will ask to stand. If they're here, they should be in one place. Where? All right, well, please stand, because it's hard for people to see this. There's a lot of people in this room, please. These are the people who meet year-round, who plan this conference, who debate every issue that we have before us, who raise the money, at least participate in the raising of the money, and to a large extent are responsible in the last instance for the success of this program. All of the members of the Left Forum Board, of which I am one, participate voluntarily, just like all the volunteers. Unlike corporate board members, we do not get paid for each attendance at a board meeting. In fact, we even pay our own fare. But it's very, very important for you to know that their names and their biographies are in the program. And I hope that you will consult them, because we've added some very new members to the board. It's not the same old anymore. And it's important for you to get acquainted with who they are. I have a few housekeeping issues, and then I will introduce our first speaker. The doors open at 7:30 tomorrow morning and 8 o'clock on Sunday. If you get there at 7:30, you probably won't experience long lines. But given the outpouring of support for this program, I really do urge you to come as early as possible. Please use the stairs when possible, so elevators are available to people most needing them. That's very, very important. I usually have, these days, because I've had a back surgery, I use elevators, and it's very disturbing not to be able to get on an elevator because people are on elevators. So I urge you to use stairs if you can. We also want you to be aware that we urge you to get ideas for sessions, to organize them for next year, starting now. Telling us is not the best way to go, given our limits and the need to organize the over 400 panels. If you can, write your suggestions down. If we have not done something that you think we ought to be doing, we are more than anxious to hear from you. Food will be generally available throughout the conference at the cafeteria on the first floor. And for those of you engaging Twitter, you can use the Left Forum Twitter hashtag. It is HASTA, H-A-S-T-A-G, Left Forum. HASTGLEFTFORUM. And one of our great regrets, while we appreciate the need for daycare, PACE can't house it for insurance reasons. We've had this dog us throughout the entire years of this conference and its predecessor, nor were nearby centers available on weekends. We appreciate the need. We'll keep looking, but we cannot offer it, and that's a terrible deficit that we are very, very seriously trying to remedy. Please help the conference to run smoothly. All sessions end 10 minutes before the hour to allow time to move from panel to panel. And because we have so many panels this year, that 10-minute rule should be as strictly observed as possible, because it will be difficult for people to move around. And tickets for the Michael Moore evening on Saturday and the closing plenary on Sunday will be available on a first-come and first-served basis, starting each day at noon at the registration tables in the hallway. There will be overflow rooms available. And believe me, there will be overflow crowds for Michael Moore and for some other activities that are taking place. We are met at a very interesting moment. There are two things going on at the same time, and I think most of you are aware of it. But I think I have a responsibility to place our situation in some kind of a framework. On the one hand, there is a national phenomenon in the United States, and to a large extent in Western Europe as well, which has observed the resurgence of the right wing. They not only dominate the politics, which I think is second to their major domination, they dominate the ideological hegemony. Everybody shifted to the right, and all the debates that we have now are debates that maybe some years ago we never would have entertained. We face a two-party system, which is essentially, it has differences, yes, we can name those differences, a member of the Supreme Court who just voted for a restriction of Miranda, one of Obama's appointees, with 5 other conservatives. But we have to take solace in that. But the truth of the matter is that every issue is now either a defense of what we have gained in the past, abortion, family planning, as it were, it used to be called, contraception. You feel like, are we back in 1942? No, seriously. That kind of defense that we're facing is very serious. And as a result of the defensiveness that we are forced into, what we defend to going forward, and I'm going to say it very clearly, a seriously flawed health benefits program whose main beneficiaries will be the insurance company. That's what we're forced to defend right now. And of course, what is obviously true is that Obamacare is Romneycare with some differences. We have to face that. I'm going to be short, but secondly, we have developed in this society, and you may disagree, and I'm speaking for myself, this is not the board's consensus, although there may be agreement on the board with some of the things I'm saying. We are living in this society with an increasingly militarized culture where the coercive power of the state dominates its legitimating power, if I may use the traditional phrase. They don't need to do the welfare state the way they used to. In the welfare state that they do is seriously crippled. We have over 200 military bases abroad. We still have a war in Afghanistan. If you think we're leaving Afghanistan, then you also believe in the tooth fairy. The dark clouds are gathering around the question of whether or not we're going to invade Iran. And you can trace a lot of this militarization to the fact that there is no will, as well as perhaps no political debate about how to meet people's needs. Not just the needs of the poor, the needs of all working people, the needs of the middle class. And when you can't meet people's needs, or won't meet people's needs, then what you have is the iron fist, and that's what we're beginning to see more and more and more of. That's on one hand. The militarization of American society also extends, for example, to the education system, and those who have any familiarity with public education in New York City as well as in the country, and racial profiling on the streets of New York City that our great police commissioner Ray Kelly defends every chance he can. But in the schools, we have a nothing less than a police state. Kids are regimented. The basic function of teachers is to teach, to test, and discipline kids. There's no education going on to speak of in many of our schools. There are exceptions, of course, but that's the exceptions to the rules. And then on the other hand, we have the exhilarating experience of the Occupy movement. The exhilarating experience of the Occupy movement does not only consist in protest and resistance, but it consists in the enormous capacity for innovation of the activists of the Occupy. They don't simply march up and down, holding their placards of protest and of resistance. What they have also done is said that the real question, at least a real question in the Occupy movement, is whose space is public space? Does it belong to the corporations? Does it belong to the cops? Or does it belong to us? And so we have the obligation as well as the possibility, they say, of occupying public space. Occupying public space may not stop with Zuccotti Park and places like it. It may end up being occupations of factories, of hospitals. And so when people say these are the darkest times, I have to vehemently disagree. And I probably should not quote Charles Dickens. I know. Bill Tabb is our internal cop. And I appreciate that. That's what I should do. I should probably not, and this was going to be my last remark, but these are the best of times and these are the worst of times. Both of these things have to be kept in mind as we go forward, both at this conference and go forward together. So let me get down to business. What did I do with my... I know, here it is. We have a special guest who will be our first speaker. He is Nemo Bassi, is the Executive Director of the Environmental Rights Action Friends of the Earth, Nigeria, and Chair of Friends of the Earth International. He also coordinates Oil Watch International, a global South network that campaigns against human and environmental abuses related to the oil and gas extractive activities. He co-founded the Environmental Rights Action in 1993 in response to widespread environmental degradation and human rights abuses in Nigeria. Bassi has authored books on the environment, architecture, management, and poetry. His poetry collections include We Thought It Was Oil, But It Was Blood, and I Will Not Dance to Your Beat. His latest book, To Cook a Continent, deals with the destructive extractive activities and the climate crisis in Africa. He was a recipient of the 2010 Rights Livelihood Award, and also known as the Alternative Nobel Prize.
Good evening, brothers and sisters. Good evening, friends. Good evening, in-laws and outlaws. Thank you, Stanley, for that friendly introduction and for all the information that we got from the introductory remarks. It is a great pleasure for me to be at the Left Forum. I believe the best way to work is left, the best way to live is left, and the best way to do things is left. Unfortunately, the world has gone so far right, and everything is going so far wrong, that it's time to change direction, and the direction to go is left. I bring greetings from occupied Nigeria, and I think it's time for us to occupy the planet. Because we are at a point in history where injustice has been elevated to the status of a creed. We're at a point in history where falsehood is truth. A point in history where humans negate all that has been learned over centuries of interactions with Mother Earth. We're at a point in time where imperialism doesn't come like sheep in wolf's clothing. It comes with fangs extended and claws stuck into your back. We've got to a time where wages are so poor that for the reproduction of labor, workers have to subsidize with their own blood. We've come to a time in history, a very important moment in history, that we must take our stand and make the change that is needed. At this point, I bring to mind the conclusions reached by Frantz Fanon in 1956, when he sent in his resignation letter to the French government. He said, and I quote, "The function of a social structure is to set up institutions to serve man's needs. A society that drives its members to desperate solutions is a non-viable society, a society to be replaced." We cannot watch while the 1% fat cats continue to wallow in and feast on the misery of the 99%. We cannot tolerate a system that sees 1 billion people go to bed hungry every day, and about 2 billion go without electricity. Across the African continent, and indeed the global south, there is a march of the forces of neocolonialism, playing out the script of land grab, seed grab, soil grab, and sea grab. And right now, a critical struggle is for us to decolonize the atmosphere. Because as we all know, the atmosphere has been colonized with carbon, to the extent that the small fraction that is left is still being debated about who will occupy it and who will pollute it. And we are saying it's time to stop the pattern of so-called progress and development and growth that is driving the planet to the brink. It's time to live with the knowledge that we have only one planet Earth. There's no planet B, as we say. There's no need to pretend that we can move from here to live on Mars or on Venus or Mercury or somewhere else. This is what we've got. And it's only the 1% who could afford the right to go into space. And we won't let them escape after they destroy planet Earth. I come from a country that is heavily degraded by the extractive industry, some of whom have their bases right here in the belly of the beast. The pursuit of crude oil keeps generating wars in the world and dislocating political systems and cultures. And all this happened primarily for the benefit of petro-military industrial complex and for the consolidation of neoliberal hegemonies, which we must confront and stop. Oil can be left in the soil and coal in the hole and tar sands in the land. The world has to move seriously and quickly to a pattern of development based on renewable energies. Sometimes when we say the oil should be left in the soil, people think it's a pipe dream. But I tell you, the people of Ogoniland in Nigeria have enforced oil in the soil since 1993. And nobody's going to reopen the oil wells of Ogoniland except, first of all, they clean up Ogoniland. And by independent assessment, it requires a lifetime to clean up Ogoniland. But we cannot despair. What we demand is that the cleanup should be done now. Now, we've seen other examples of places where oil has been kept in the soil. We've seen the Yasuni ITT in Ecuador. We see Lofoten in Norway. we see in South Sudan, the newest country on the planet, to avoid the exploitation and the grabbing of their oil by Sudan, they've decided to leave the oil in the soil until they can build a pipeline, of course. But it is very encouraging that this can be done by a nation who has very little resources. So if a nation like South Sudan can leave the oil in the soil, even if it's just for 2 days, then the whole world should know that it's time to move away from fossil fuels. And we need to demand this. At the Durban Climate Conference in November and December 2011, it was finally displayed to the whole world that the multilateral negotiation systems in the world have been totally captured by corporations. And political leaders are nothing more than shoe-shine boys for corporations. And so whatever the corporations want, that's what they do. And so the corporations said, don't cut emissions. Let us continue to pollute. And so they say, okay, we're going to cool down till 2015 before we begin to negotiate again. And maybe 2020, we can begin to put what we negotiate into practice. What a shame to political leaders in the world, that they will resort to kicking the can down the road, while poor people, vulnerable countries around the world, are already heavily impacted by global warming. When Africa is impacted with desertification, famine is already taking root in parts of the continent, and small island states are already going underwater. Climate refugees are not imaginary people. And so the political system must be liberated from the clutches of transnational corporations. What we're seeing now can best be characterized as global apartheid, and it must be confronted. When leaders abdicate their responsibility to protect and cede their authority to corporate hawks, it is time for us to forge new ways and processes, not only for the emergence of genuine leaders, but also for the exercise of leadership. In a few weeks, world leaders will be meeting in Rio, Brazil, not to remember what happened in 1992 Earth Summit, but to enthrone market environmentalism. They're going to meet in Rio to set out the final parameters to commodify Mother Earth. And we should look at our leaders when they begin to move, to tell them, look, we cannot accept using the planet as a tool or as an instrument in the marketplace, because we don't own the earth. We are all children of Mother Earth. It is really disturbing the way political leaders and the corporations have grabbed all the beautiful words that we used to know. Now I don't even know what the color green means. We have a green economy. You see trees as carbon stocks, not as trees. Forests, no longer as forests, but as reserves for carbon sequestration. What has gone wrong with mankind? I believe we've gone so far right, we don't even know where to turn back. And we need to encourage, we need people, we need marshals, left forum marshals, to help redirect our leaders who are lost in the jungles of capital. The word sustainable development is no longer recognizable. In fact, when I hear sustainable in official circles, I think of blindfold or anesthesia. Because we're doing something sustainable, so I go to sleep and believe them. And while I sleep, they are draining my blood. The pressure to keep minimizing government. Have you heard that? Government is too big. We have to shrink government. What does it really mean? It means taking power away from the public realm and concentrating power in a few private hands. And you know, they will redefine democracy as government of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. But do you accept that? That is crazy. That is not democracy. In Nigeria, we will say them all crazy. Honestly, we've hit the bottom. And the only sane way to go is a path of harmony with Mother Earth. And we, the people, at this left forum, can and must provide the needed balance. This is an inescapable challenge. It's also a moral duty, and we must make it happen. We have seen the spontaneous uprisings from North Africa and in the Arab world. We have seen the growing global Occupy movement, and yes, the January 12th uprising in my home country, Nigeria, clearly indicating that people power must be regained and can be regained. Walking left is the right way to go. Let us work together in solidarity as we occupy the broken system, cause it to erupt and enthrone people's sovereignty. The time is right, the situation is right, and it's perhaps the chance of a lifetime, and we have to seize the moment. I thank you for your attention.
Our next speaker is an anomaly. She's a radical, militant trade unionist who was a member of the AFL-CIO Executive Council. Roseann Demoro is Executive Director of the National Nurses United, the nation's largest union of nurses. Demoro is also Executive Director of the California Nurses Association, which is well known for. She actually has been famous for upending one of the world's most famous celebrity politicians, Arnold Schwarzenegger, dropping his public approval from 70% to 35% under Demoro's stewardship. The NNU and the CNA is also renowned for leading national advocates of single-payer Medicare for all health care reform. Over the past year, NNU has led a national campaign calling for a tax on Wall Street, also known as the Robin Hood tax, and has supported the Occupy Wall Street movement with nurses' first aid stations from New York to San Francisco. I give you with great pleasure.
Thank you, Stanley. It's quite a trip, quite a privilege to be here with you, one of my heroes. So thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you all. I really want to do the speech on why I really loathe liberals, but I just get so wound up. Our communications director, Chuck Idleson, always winds me up every time I start to speak about something, and then I just go off in another direction. But I'll tell you, this pole-driven, I can't take it anymore. We just live in this shallow culture with this dribble that comes out of the mouth of these people who bolster these Democrats and give them cover and make them think that it's okay. They worship at the altar of bipartisanship, and the goal is bipartisanship. It's not a means to an end. It's become the goal. And in doing that, they disavow class awareness, class consciousness, class. So, for example, how many of you are here from the labor movement? All right, our labor movement, and yes, Stanley, I am a part of it, coined the phrase, "We are one." Now, they took that campaign, which was a consultant-created campaign. The difference between the right and the left: the right tells the consultants what to do, and the consultants tell the left what to do. In labor. I'm not saying here. Present company accepted. We are one. I mean, what happened to us versus them? You know, it's like nurses don't think their bosses are their friends. And in fact, they fight against them every single day. And if I ever adopted the posture that your boss was your friend, they'd kick my ass out of that organization so fast I'd see my head spin. We're not one. And I can't even get like where that pandering goes. It's a disavowing of class. My best guess is they think the servile posture will overwhelm them into submission. We are one, don't hurt us. I mean, it's just outrageous. There's a working class movement, the Occupy movement. Like, God love them, man, I'll tell you. It's out there. They don't say we are one. They say we're the 99% and screw you 1%. Anyway, but I love the left forum. You're never, ever, ever afraid to speak truth to power. You've been doing it for your... Continue to do it. You can count on the fact... I mean, there's so many of us that count on that kind of beacon of hope out there when we're kind of swimming in the sea of whatever. I also want to thank the intellectuals, the teachers, I've had great experiences at the university. I was at the University of Santa Barbara working on my doctorate degree, and I had very radical faculty in the sociology department, and very close with them today, but they basically said, you need to get out of here and go work for the labor movement. And boy, they were so right. I think they were just trying to get rid of me, but when I look back, the intellectual thought is so critical, and it needs to be in the labor movement, and it shapes our minds, and it shapes our values. And I just, Rick Santorum didn't miss that, right? And he wasn't talking about most academics. He was talking about you guys. I mean, that guy, in America, sometimes we elevate stupid to the new smart, and he is the gold standard. Oh, God, there's so much. It's like, oh, God, there's just so much. Right, let me tell you about our organization, because it is a great, wonderful organization with a great bunch of people who love to have fun and know who the enemy is. You cannot fool nurses, right? I mean, you just can't. They're looking at you and they're seeing while you're talking what's really going on with you. And they do that that's a metaphor for how they view society, right? So they look out there and they hear this, babble, this, the psychobabble, I'm okay, you're okay, whatever. And they know everything's not okay. They have to live with the fallout in the society, what's happening to their patients every day as they fight their employers, and they see the types of lives their patients have when they don't get the type of care that they need, when children are presenting with adult conditions because of the type of diets and the culture that we have. They see the fallout. They are at ground zero of the fallout, and it's a tragedy. And they understand, and they have taken the concept of patient advocacy, and they become social advocates, and they're dynamite social advocates. Our organization is a member-driven organization. We provide tremendous education. We do political education in our organization. We do mobilization nonstop. We never stop moving. We were when Occupy got out there, we were so happy. It's like, oh, our folks actually knew how to protest. They've been doing it, for the last 20 years while everyone's kind of like stepping aside. And they're willing to take on the hard fights, the militant fights, the union fights, and we're always out on strike. And in fact, it's sad, but one of our research folks the other day looked up strikes and realized that we were leading them in the country. And I think that's a good thing, but I also think that's a bad thing because there should be fightbacks, and there should be fightbacks in labor, but we're all told to lower our expectations. Labor management partnerships, we abhor them. We won't participate in them. We think that anyone who participates in them is subordinate the needs of your patients for corporate profits. You just don't do that. Organization has not stopped laser-like focus on single payer, and bless you, Stanley, because the Obama thing, oh my God. We are aggressive union organizers. We organize outside of our comfort zones. We got California pretty nicely organized, and in fact, we won another union shop last night in California with the Sutter Corporation. That's a horrendous corporation. That's just last night. Our organizing director, David Johnson's here. It was awesome. But we organize in places like Texas and in places like Florida. We organize where a lot of people don't want to go, and for a whole lot of reasons. But what we find with the nurses is an interesting thing. They are some of our most outspoken, articulate, great fighters that we have in the organization. They've just been waiting. They've been waiting. And I think everyone's waiting out there for a labor movement that's going to really kind of jumpstart their passion. We see class solidarity as strategic and not tactical. We like genuine class solidarity. And we've got some pretty good hallmark campaigns. Stanley talked about one. We have nurse-to-patient ratios in California, and when we had our celebrity governor, well, one of the celebrity governors, California is notorious for having bozos in the governorship, but we have Ronald Reagan, now we have Arnold Schwarzenegger. So Schwarzenegger comes along and he decides he's going to roll back these hard-fought ratios that these nurses absolutely needed to be able to advocate for their patients. And at that point in time, it was really a bizarre situation. His approval rating was like, I mean, over the moon. And people, progressive people, were lined up to try to get his autograph and get their photo with him. And so when he started, and I mean, this one, I love nurses. When he started on the nurses thing, then he said, well, I'd like to meet with you. And the nurses said, the hell with you. You move off those ratios or you're not going to meet with us. We're going to meet you in the streets. And by God, that's exactly what happened. And we met him in 107 protests across this country. Here in New York City, we went to his bodybuilding contest in Ohio or wherever it was. We followed him across this country because wherever he went, he got press. And wherever he got press, we capitalized on it and we got press. And we got press making fun of him. And so what happened in time is we actually were able to overcome that. And right, Michael, it's like awesome. Michael Lighting, who is our public policy guy, was really on point on that. We just had a blast torturing Arnold. But at any rate, we put him up for sale on eBay because our philosophy was, if corporations can buy governors, why not real people? And we actually got like this bid going. I got a little bit afraid because I thought, oh, what if we have to pay like the profit on that or whatever, however eBay works on it. But anyway, we defeated his initiatives. He made the critical mistake. This is where this guy met his Waterloo, famous last words. He stood in front of a women's conference with the lovely Maria Shriver, a Democrat, and said, those, you know, we had a banner. He was theoretically a groper, and so we had a banner that we unveiled in front of the conference saying, you know, hands off our ratios, right? Kind of double entendre, pretty funny stuff. He got really like rattled at the podium like this, and he said, ignore them. Those nurses are the special interest. I kick their butts every day. Well, you know what? The nurses put the shoe on the other foot. They kicked his butt. He's out of governorship, and aloha Arnold. Then we got next up, Queen Meg, the Meg Whitman, the billionaire from eBay. This is something about eBay. Who decided she was going to run for governor following Arnold. We'd had enough of, you know, crazy. So we decided to get ahead of that campaign, and we had, since she was going to buy the election, she literally spent $160 million. I can imagine the vulgarity in this country spent $160 million, one person on herself, to put her picture on television to say, elect me, and was cynical enough to think that that was going to do it. I mean, that's pretty bad.
That's this year's MKII operating budget deficit. It cost $160 million.
You know what I like about you guys? I knew you'd have the facts, so I don't have to have them. Thank you. Exactly. Hello. What about poverty? You know, those kind of... That chick put her face on television, $160 million worth. So what we did was we dressed up an actress, called her Queen Meg, and everywhere Meg Whitman went, our Queen Meg went. And the press, because they're so shallow, got very confused, and everybody got confused. Just like, I swear to God this happened. I swear. Did Michael, did this not happen? They got very confused. So we would have our Queen Meg saying, you know, no education for you children going through the Capitol. And people got very confused, like, is that Meg Whitman? Because, oh my God, it was too much. It was so much fun. But we would have had the same scenario in California as we have in Wisconsin and Ohio and Michigan and Indiana, had it not been for the fact that, and Jerry Brown gives us full credit, that we took Meg Whitman out. He said, I hardly had to do anything. The nurses did the whole campaign, and then I just had to like run for office. So it was true, actually. We had a pretty good time on that. But it just shows these people are so shallow, and they need to be exposed. And when you get people in motion, and you can actually have people who are actually interfacing and making fun of them creatively, I will say that creatively, we can do all kinds of things. We also are involved and have been involved in Medicare for All with our single payer with Michael Moore. We've done a whole trip through the United States with the Sicko tour. And what's really sad is Michael's done some of the best depiction of human suffering in that film. And that film should be, that should be the bestseller in America. And it's so easy to ignore suffering. What a country. Clean money. We dare to try to get money out of politics. In California, we kind of fell flat. The labor movement opposed us. Corporations opposed us. We thought it was a good idea. It's like kind of newsflash to the labor movement. You're not going to outspin the right. They're like, hello. Jesus. Sort of weird, huh? At any rate, what makes us unique in the National Nurses United? I like to say it's the flatness of the surrounding terrain. But I might be in sometimes. Do not quote me out of the side of this room because I know none of you are in the labor bureaucracy except for me. Maybe not after tonight. At any rate, registered nurses, in spite of all of our antics, have #1 in credibility in this country in Gallup poll after Gallup poll. And it's really well deserved, and it's because nurses don't give up on people, and they don't ever lose hope. And I'll tell you what, these nurses are the most authentic players you'll ever deal with. They can sniff out BS. They know who's real. They know what's real. They care. That's what they do. They don't do partisan politics. They actually care for people, and they know that they have to care for society in order to care for people, and you can trust them. I've had just such an incredible privilege working with them for 26 years now. I never thought that would happen when I went to work for nurses, and I found, oh my God, it's just like finding gold. I mean, it's pure hearts, good people, kind people, passionate people, compassionate people. It's every dream. I think I've got the best job in America because they're up for anything, and they've got the most credibility. They're strategically located in all communities across this country, and they want to do social change. And they like me. It's like we're such a match. I'm not kidding. We have a great time. Our priorities right now are Medicare for all, single payer still. Can you imagine that in the United States of America, and it's such a disgrace, we have international guests here, but it's such a disgrace that this country would not care for its own. I mean, you take care of your people. You take care of your people. And what the nurses see literally should be a crime. The people who are so gutless and the people who give them cover in Washington, D.C. should be put in prison for the human suffering they cause. There's this arbitrary number. It was 65, and that's when you get Medicare, right? And so we want Medicare for all. We want it improved because it needs improvement. And the greatest story I have that illustrates the need for that and how arbitrary it is, there was a patient who was a man who was 64 years old and was going to turn 65 in just a few days. He was on one of the operating tables in San Diego. One of our nurses told me the story that this man was pleading. He had open heart surgery, and he was pleading with the nurses and the doctors if he could just wait for a few more days because he would be 65, and if he had that operation that day, he would become bankrupt. That is such a disgrace, but it's such a poignant story in terms of telling the case about the arbitrariness of our what you call health insurance system, which is what we have. So we want Medicare for all. The nurses, actually, what I love about it is that they have great contracts. We fought every employer imaginable and some really bloody fights, but they've got great contracts, great benefits, great pensions. And you know what? They believe everyone should. And they think this concessions, walking in for concessions, Labor is thinking of a strategy of proposing concessions up front. I mean, that's just, how did we ever devolve this far where we would propose our own concessions? It's like, it's the Stockholm Syndrome. It literally is. It's like, God. Anyway, good jobs, our Main Street campaign, good jobs, healthcare, pensions, and a just society. Our probably most critical campaign, we're going to get single payer. I swear to you, we're going to do everything in this country to embarrass these people into getting out of the way. And all of the people who are giving them cover, exposing them. We have a great group in America, Healthcare Now. They've done great work on single payer, Physicians for National Healthcare, the nurses. There's all these great groups that have been doing this work on single payer. Then they started having the dialogue about single payer in Washington, D.C. So they create their own groups. And I imagine some of you are in them, and you'll really love me for this. Healthcare for America Now, right? Now, Healthcare for America Now raises $40 million. Healthcare for America Now says, we will never compromise off of single payer. And the president in the White House says, oh, yes, you will. And they go, all right, we'll compromise there. But we will never compromise off of a public option. And the White House says, we will fight to the death for a public option. You know, labor movement, yeah, HCAN, fighting for the public option. And then the White House says, no, no, no. All right, but here's our line in the sand. Here's our line in the sand, the ever-shifting line in the sand. I'd love to negotiate against these guys. It's so easy. But we will never agree to an individual mandate. And the White House says, you're having an individual mandate. And they say, rah-rah, individual mandate, go for it. And they're like actually the rallying troops for the individual mandate now at a position they said that they would never accept. That's set up. That's contrived. That's liberals. That's our political group in D.C. that give these bozos in the White House cover so they never enact real reforms. They're the cover. They're the class collaborators. We've always had them in history. What we have to do is to ignore them, ignore D.C., and actually start a people's movement in this country. I did get off my speech here, damn it. I just want to, before I do, I just want to talk about the public option. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't want to talk about the public option. I want to talk about the most probably significant global campaign that we're engaged in, and that's a campaign for a financial transaction tax. And we are working with some incredible people, Robert Poland from UMass, David Hillman, who's here from Stamp Out Poverty, people from the UK, the Robin Hood people, just really incredible players on the global scene. And we're working to enact a global financial transaction tax. And this goes at the heart of capital. It goes at the heart of capital. It's a non-reformist reform. It's a systemic reform. It basically taxes these these financial institutions 50 cents on every $100. I mean, I think they can afford it. It's a drop in the bucket. It could generate up to $350 billion a year into this economy. $350 billion just for 50 cents on $100 on their gambling trades. Everyone should get involved with this campaign because it doesn't put anybody out of business. It doesn't send jobs overseas. So all the answers that we always hear when we embark upon our campaign to tax the rich, those answers are gone. They've concentrated power and wealth at the top so significantly that they think they're untouchable. Well, you know what? We've got a global movement. We're going to stop them. And it's the most significant movement, I think, that's going on internationally because it's about transformation of the economy to a sustainable economy, not one that's on bubbles and trickles and everything else that these guys can imagine. So we actually really would appreciate you joining with us. Just one quick story on the financial transaction tax, and I'll be done, I promise. The legislators are so dismissive of the nurses, and the nurses really get this financial transaction tax, and it's the most critical question. And so the nurses fanned out in the legislature, and one of the legislators, progressive legislators, said, well, you nurses need to lower your expectations. Right? And the nurse turned to her and said, would you like me to say that to you when you're on my operating table?
Roseann will be speaking tomorrow at one of the panels at 3 o'clock about labor. Marina Sitrin has been an actor in the Occupy movement worldwide. She's the editor of Horizontalism, Voices of Popular Power in Argentina, and author of Everyday Revolutions, Horizontalism and Autonomy in Argentina, forthcoming. She's a lawyer and a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Globalization and Social Change at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She's also a student, teacher, dreamer, and militant. Her books touch upon issues of state practices of co-optation and repression in relation to social movements, mobilizations to build autonomy and direct democracy. I give you Marina Sitrin.
Wow, it's really hard because I can't see people, but I've been seeing people all day who are part of Occupy, and that's just really fabulous. So it's like one coming together we're going to have all weekend. I just want to start actually with who has participated in some way in the Occupy movement. You were there, you stopped by, you wrote about it. Who believes that it changed things in society? Has it changed you? Right? This is part of what I'm going to get at and what I'm talking about. And the Yes magazine came out with a book that said this changes everything. And I think it's a really appropriate title. And what began as a moment has now turned to a movement. And we have the opportunity going into the spring and the future to not only deepen that movement, but I think to go beyond not only movements. So part of what I'm going to be talking about is taking ourselves seriously and pushing even further what is possible. Things like in Greece, out and through the movements, workers have taken over a hospital and are recuperating it and are going to run it themselves using assemblies. A newspaper as well. This is just in Greece. So one of the main things, I mean, so many people talk about the main thing the movement, the Occupy movement has done. Well, I think one of the main things we've done globally is make democracy a question. And not a question of, oh, we need more representative democracy and framing it in that way, but people seeing that more and more, that we can't have democracy with capitalism. And what... And so what we're doing is moving towards our creating what democracy can look like. It's still a question. And also moving beyond capitalism. So what I'm going to talk about is the Occupy movement and also a bit about my experience in Argentina and the autonomous social movements in Argentina. And I know it goes without saying, but I'm speaking as Marina. I'm not speaking for the Occupy movement. We are a movement. It is horizontal. It has so many different opinions in it, and that's the beauty of the movement. No one actually speaks for Occupy, having recently been quoted by Glenn Beck as saying, the Occupy movement is against capitalism, Marina is against capitalism. Lots of people in the movement have a lot of different opinions in relationship to this. Okay. So just as far as my personal participation in the Occupy movement, when I came to my first assembly in August in Tompkins Square Park, it was actually shocking. There were dozens and dozens of people, 60 or 70 people. I actually recognize some of you here. And what it looked like and felt like to me, having been involved in the global justice movement, is something like the assemblies we had in Seattle or in the Direct Action Network in New York. People sitting in a circle using these forms, the twinkling, the process points, all of the kind of tools of consensus building were very much in those initial days and weeks, seeming to me, feeling like global justice movement. And then we occupied. And in those first days in Zuccotti Park, as we turned it into Liberty Plaza, it felt more and more like the images I'd seen from Spain and Greece, of masses of people making decisions together in a plaza. And then as the weeks went on, it began to remind me more and more of Argentina post-2001. So that's that link I'm going to make. And common with all of these, Greece, Spain, Argentina, occupied throughout the entire United States, is both the forms of organization that we're using and that it was a break. And this break is really important. There's this quote that I love by Walter Benjamin, and who would have figured that now he's being quoted all over on blogs, this quote in particular. It's a very interesting moment. But he said, Marx said that revolutions are the locomotive of world history. But perhaps things are very different. It may be that revolutions are the act by which the human race, traveling in the train, applies the emergency brake. And that, see, it resonates, but Walter Benjamin, who would have thought that Occupy movements and bloggers around the country are going to start talking about pulling the emergency brake? But it is that. It's that the movement's saying no, and stopping and freezing time. And that's the occupations all over around the world in saying that no and freezing time. The ya basta, going back to the Zapatistas in Chiapas in 1994, that ya basta, enough. The que se vayan todos in Argentina, that they all must go. And kifaya in Egypt, going back to before the occupation of Tahrir Square, this enough, this stop moment. And then in that stopping, it's not just a stop. It's not a stop that then makes a demand. It's a stop that then opens up something new. And in that new, it's the new that is the horizontal relationships that I'm going to talk more about, but these creating relationships with one another. It's not a thing. Horizontalidad, horizontalism, this is not a thing. It's a relationship that people create with one another, but trying to create new ways of hearing and being and seeing one another without having power over each other. And doing that in some kind of space, whether that's called territory or but in some kind of physical space together where we can look to one another. And these are the same features that we also saw in Argentina and continue to see in many ways in Argentina, where in 2001, after years of horrible privatization, there was an economic crisis and an economic collapse. And the government's response to that crisis was seeing what had been done in the United States in the 1930s and fearing people would actually take their money out of the banks. They froze people's bank accounts. And in response to that and quite a few other things, there was what a lot of people in Argentina actually refer to as a rupture. There was this break. And in that break, people went out on the street. And they went out on the street banging pots and pans. It's called the cacerola. And people would describe this, thousands and thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people banging on pots and pans. It wasn't a movement of political parties. It wasn't a movement organized by the traditional trade unions or any of the political organizations. There were no party placards. What people went out and said with their bodies in moving, and then with words was que se vayan todos, que no quede ni uno solo, which is that they all must go, not one should remain. And they actually did force out 4 consecutive governments. In that moment, and people being in the street together, then they also talk about finding each other and beginning to have this new meeting, like what we've been doing in the plazas all over the United States and what so many people have been doing even before around the world. Is finding one another, and in Argentina what they started to call it was horizontalidad, which is where now when we use the language of horizontal and horizontalism, actually the first time I ever know of that language being used was in Argentina post-2001, and it was horizontalidad. And it was used in urban areas, in the different neighborhoods, in unemployed movements as people who had already been organizing in the later 90s but were coming together and organizing to take over land, find different ways to survive in this horizontal way. Art collectives, media collectives, and workplaces more and more as they were getting recuperated were using forms of horizontalidad. And this relationship is this horizontal relationship that also has a different concept of power. That power is something that we create together. It's not about asking or demanding of a government or an institutional power of something, but creating it together. Something very familiar with the Occupy movements, right? And also talking about autonomy. So what we're doing and how we're doing it is creating a form of autonomy together. And one of the forms of doing and things that people were creating, they use the language of autogestión, which I still think is not. It's difficult to translate because while it means self-management and self-organization, in this context it also implies this horizontal social relationship. So people were using autogestión, self-organizing in this horizontal way by taking over land and growing crops and food and medicine and education. And one of the massive movements that also started were the workplace recuperations. And they are workplaces. This is, they're traditional factories, print shops, things like that, metal shops, but also hotels, medical clinics, schools, newspapers, all kinds of places of work. And they're recuperations, not occupations, that the way it's talked about is taking something back. Most of these, now this started in 2001, and there are 300 plus recuperated workplaces now in Argentina. the vast majority using some form of, they all use some form of assemblies, the majority use some form of horizontalidad. And when they describe what they're doing, it's both complicated and also really simple. They borrowed the slogan of the landless movement of Brazil, occupy, resist, produce. I mean, I'm kind of doing this really short in a nutshell. It's a longer story, but they also will explain it, a lot of workers, as, yes, it's really scary and it's really complicated, and it's not really, because we know how to work. We work with each other, we form the assembly, we take back the workplace. The community, it's very popular, so people in neighborhoods and in the communities and other recuperated workplaces all help support this process of recuperation, and then they decide together what the priorities are of the workplace, and they've been running them and surviving, and those that have existed for a few years are actually doing better, and this is this interesting question, doing better. So monetarily, their salaries are better than they were, but what they talk about is kind of a different standard of how they're doing better. That measurement of doing better and being better is about how they're relating to one another, how they're relating to other workplaces, and what I think is actually a different kind of value that's being created. Now, of course, this is still under capitalism, and there are the rules of the capitalist market and everything else, but at the same time, the choices that are being made in a lot of these workplaces are choices about bartering with one another. There are choices all the time about showing solidarity with other recuperated workplaces. So while it might be the most economically efficient or productive to have workers working all the time, they make choices all the time to release workers to go show solidarity to other workplaces. Or in the afternoons and the evenings, they open up the workplaces for people to run clinics. People in the neighborhoods have clinics and computer programs. There are these bachilleratos now, which are alternative high school programs, where there are thousands and thousands of people who are getting their GED in a recuperated workplace with volunteers, many of whom used to be in the neighborhood assembly, studying things like cooperativism. They decide together what they're going to study. So these workplaces are being used for many, many things. And this is just one of the kinds of experiences that I'm thinking about when I think how much more seriously we need to take ourselves and our movements, and thinking about it in terms of workplace recuperation. So the workers in Chicago recently reoccupied. They have, I think it's 80 more days, 70 more days to decide what they're going to do. And one of those options could be a recuperation. How popular would that be? And just imagining how many more possibilities we have kind of in these terms. So thinking much bigger as far as what's possible. I also, those of us in Occupy, hate this issue of money. It's become this really big problem. I think we should give it all to the workers in Chicago as they're making the decision whether or not they should recuperate their workplaces. Okay, let's bring that to the next assembly. So as kind of looking at the experience in Argentina now and in the past in our movements throughout the United States and all of the occupies, in Greece, in Spain, in Egypt, what we're experimenting with and creating are, in these new horizontal forms, new ways of being and producing together, and creating ourselves anew in this process, and in it also creating a new dignity. There's so many lessons that we can learn, and we are learning, I think, from one another around the world now, but also we can learn historically, Argentina, questions about the state and the NGOs and co-optation and repression, and there's so much we have to learn, and we can learn all of this together. And in learning it, so that, again, being really serious, that we go beyond being a movement and go beyond capitalism.
It gives me a great pleasure to introduce a very old friend of mine, William Strickland, who spent his early years of political activism working as executive director of the Northern Student Movement, which wanted to be the Northern analog of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, working for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and working on the Harlem rent strikes in the 1960s. That's where we met, actually. During this time, Strickland also worked with Malcolm X whom he knew from his childhood days. A graduate of Boston Latin School, Harvard College, Harvard University. He currently is director of the Du Bois Papers collection at the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of African and Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, where he also teaches political science. I give you Bill Strickland.
I want to begin by thanking the Left Forum for inviting me to participate, because it has given me the opportunity to reflect on my past, and also to see people like Stanley. When I was young and very innocent, this was back in the day. There's a documentary about the Southern struggle called "It Was a Mighty, Mighty Time." And back then it was a mighty, mighty time, because it was Malcolm, Miss Baker was here, Malcolm X was here, Jesse Gray was here, Barry Rusted was here doing school boycotts. It was, as we used to say in the corner, cheap code. The joint. Gene, is that you? And so I was able to work with, as Stanley was one of the people who was helping us young people at the time, and Danny Schechter, who's sitting over here. We worked together back in the day. I can't see everybody. Any old SNCC people here? I wanted to, however, take exception to a couple of things that Stanley said. I do think the time is unprecedented. And I want to explain why I think it's unprecedented. At one level of historical logic, we can say that feudalism was logical. And slavery was logical. But now we are dealing with a ruling class, this 1%, that is irrational, that is idiotic, that has let loose forces that it cannot control itself. When Nima was speaking earlier, if Celsius goes up 3 degrees, it's the end of Africa. Maldives will go underwater, and you may not know it, but you are on the same latitude and longitude as Maldives. If Maldives goes, New York City goes. But they don't care. They do not care. We need to understand what the challenge is. The challenge is that America is an empire. The problem is it can no longer be an empire and serve the needs of the nation. Therefore, all 50 states are bankrupt. And why are they bankrupt? Because corporations do not pay taxes. They pay 6.6% of the taxes. America is now the greatest debtor nation in the history of the world. Understand that. When Bush left, we were $10 trillion in debt. We are now $16 trillion in debt. And Obama tells us he has created 2.8 million jobs, but we have exported 8 million jobs. And why should we not when we subsidize the export of jobs? When is the last time you picked up your telephone and called anywhere, to your doctor's office, to the motion picture theater, to the dentist's office, to the supermarket, and spoke to a human being? Quando fue? So I'm arguing, and it's also true, Stanley, America does not have 200 bases worldwide. It has 900 bases worldwide. It has 450 bases in Afghanistan alone. And it built in Iraq the greatest embassy in the history of the United States military. It cost $1 billion. And if you wish to have any idea of how Walt Disney-like your government is, you should read a very wonderful book by a Washington Post reporter. I'm going to screw up his name, Rajiv Chandrasekaran, something like that. But the book is called Imperial Life in the Emerald City. Imperial Life in the Emerald City. If you read that book, it will show you just how Walt Disney-like the American occupation of Iraq was under Bush Cheney. And how many Iraqis have we killed? Hundreds of thousands. So let me ask you another question. How many of you watched the Arab Spring on television? Tunisia, Egypt. How many? The rest of you guys weren't watching it too? All right. Now every day we are confronted with what is happening in Syria. Well, let us stop and think. That means the American media has the capacity to give you on-site coverage from the Middle East. Now let me ask you another question. When is the last time you saw on-site coverage from Kabul and Baghdad? When all you've heard is the military giving you the same wonderfully accurate explanations that they gave you in relation to Jessica Lynch, Pat Tillman, and Vietnam. The same military. And I speak from personal experience because I was in the Marine Corps. You know. So we need to understand the times are fundamentally different. And we have a problem about being successful to change this country. Once upon a time, Malcolm X said, a third of Americans want to do the right thing. Another third don't know what the right thing is, and the last third is hopeless. Well, that last third has got greater, and greater. If you go back and look at the Republican Party, there's a difference, as crooked as he was, between Richard Nixon and George Bush and Ronald Reagan and Michelle Bachmann, Sarah Palin, etc., etc., etc. They have reached out and brought into their party these, euphemistically, let us call them knuckleheads. But if we are going to try and affect change in the country, we have to understand the problems that we face. There was a man many years ago whose name was Vladimir Ulyanov. He was born in 1870. And when he began to struggle for change in his country, he said something that we need to take to heart. And let's put up. He said, look like the enemy, talk like the enemy. You can even act like the enemy, but think for yourself. We have to appreciate what America is. If we're going to make change and try and reach those two-thirds, you must think about what happens when we identify ourselves as leftists. What happens? We are automatically dismissed. You must think about how they have socialized this population for the last 6 decades. And what have they done? How has the right come to power? It's another taboo question. It's called racism. In 1955, the Republican Party adopted the Southern strategy. And what was the Southern strategy? What you were not taught in your high schools is that the South ruled the country. You go back and look at your Constitution. They were able to rule the country because of the concessions they forced upon the North. There would not have been a United States of America if the North had not conceded. So you have only 2 senators for every state, regardless of the population of those states. You have an electoral college, to which I will come back. And they also had something called the federal ratio, where they got 3/5 of a vote for every black person they owned. It was those extra 8 electoral votes that made Thomas Jefferson the 3rd president of the United States. And it was that extra black presence that enabled the South to rule this country in the antebellum period. And when they could no longer rule it, they split. Next year will be the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was, quote, an act of military necessity because the North was losing the war. When the war was over, with the assistance of 200,000 black people in the Army and 20,000 in the Navy, and taking away the institution of slavery from the South, Abraham Lincoln said, take from the field the black troops we now have, we would lose the war in 3 weeks. They never told you that, because it defies sanity to think about the contribution black people have made and then how we were betrayed. So they had to pass the 13th Amendment because slavery was legal. That's why they had to pass the 13th Amendment. And then the South started killing people and passing the Black Code. So the Republican Party was faced with the dire prospect of winning the war and losing control of the government again, and therefore they had to pass the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. I'm researching this period now between 1865 and 1900 because I'm concerned about another significant element left out of American history, and that is a word that is not acceptable in academia. The word is murder. If you look at the man who put forward the first anti-lynching law in this country, he was a congressman from North Carolina named George Henry White. So I'm researching George Henry White, looking at his speech before Congress. And he says, between 1865 and 1900, 53,000 of my people were murdered. That averages out to about 1,350 a year, but it's not in the books. We are now trying to validate the accuracy of White's accusation. Anyway, the blacks are betrayed, and the South takes that political power of exploiting the black political body, and then they rule this country. They created little wonderful things, the filibuster. They created the 2/3 rule, which you're still dealing with. But think about the relevance of it. And the Democratic Party, which overthrew, was the party of the Ku Klux Klan. In 1924, the Democratic Party had the longest political convention in the history of American politics. It went 16 days, 113 ballots, putting forward their own candidate for president. And if you go back and look at that time, they marched down Pennsylvania Avenue, 40,000 strong, but that's suppressed in your history too. I mention all this to bring us to the present, because with that power, they prevented an anti-lynching bill. They prevented the protocol against genocide, because they were the senior people in the House and in the Senate. And that's what the Republicans went to. They wanted to take the South away from the Democratic Party, and that's what they have done. Now, I want you to calculate what I'm about to explain to you. There are 150 states and 2 senators, i.e. 100. There are 435 congresspersons. It's a total of 535 votes. In order to become president of the United States, you need 271 electoral votes. The 11 states of the Confederacy equal 60% of all that's necessary to become president of the United States. If you win the correct number of 16 states, you or your dog can become president. That's what the Republicans have done. In 1972, Bush was the first Republican to win all states of the Confederacy. And then along came Ronald Reagan. He kicked off his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1980, where Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman were killed. He was endorsed by the Klan, and then, of course, he rejected the endorsement. But that's the racial politics the Republicans have used. Willie Horton with Bushy, and then Bushy Jr. stole the 2000 and 2004 elections. And we get back to the eunuchs in the Democratic Party. Because instead of saying the Supreme Court stopped the voting recount in Florida, to talk about Jeb Bush and Katherine Harris, head of Bush's campaign and Secretary of State, they blamed it all on Ralph Nader. Then move back 6 years. The Republicans impeached Clinton for lying about an affair, sexual affair, but the Democrats would not impeach Bush for lying about a war. So if you go, they're probably taking it down. But if you go to John Conyers' website, when he was chair of the House Subcommittee, his staff prepared a report on Iraq called Constitution in Crisis. It will blow your mind. If you're old enough to remember, haven't repressed the memory, you remember when General Powell came to the United Nations with all of his charts and his graphs to explain why we were going to initiate shock and awe. And if you ever think about that phrase, shock and awe. Once upon a time when I was in high school, we had to choose between German and Greek, and I walked into the Greek and saw these little funny hieroglyphs, so I thought, I was here by Steenberg, and I took German. When I heard shock and awe, the first thing that came to my mind was Blitzkrieg. Verstehst du? Blitzkrieg. All right. So here we are now. The Republicans are challenged. They control the Supreme Court. They control 11 of the 13 appeals courts. 5 corporations control the media. And they're privatizing everything. They're privatizing prisons, privatizing education. They want to privatize Medicare and Social Security. And they privatize the military. You also don't know, Bush privatized 25% of the IRS. They were not given the charge to investigate corporations. I had a graduate student who made $23,000. They investigated her. There were 113,000 private military contractors in Iraq, as opposed to 90,000 U.S. troops. More private military contractors died last year than American military troops. There are 18 attempted suicides by veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan every day. 18 a day attempted suicides. There is no question being asked, where does this PTSD come from? It's never existed before in any of America's wars. What is driving the vets crazy? So they kill themselves and or they kill other people. What? But there is no discussion in this country about real discussion about PTSD or what in fact is going on in Iraq and Afghanistan. So what must we do? One of the challenges, perhaps the most important, is longevity. What distinguishes the right from us? I was a patron for Planned Parenthood. There's a group up in Northampton, actually, called Tapestry Health, where they were celebrating the 39th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. Now think about the difference between us and the right. 39th anniversary. The right has been fighting against Roe v. Wade for 4 decades. We need that kind of longevity. We also need an analysis because we don't have an analysis of this system. One of the things I learned working with Jesse Gray, this system is unfair everywhere. Understand? So we have a zillion groups dealing with a particular contradiction: education, housing, racial profiling, police brutality. You name it, Citizens for Tax Justice. Because of the uniformity of unfairness, of injustice, we have a zillion groups working at it. We do not have an analysis of how this system works and what it's being. We can't say capitalism. How does it work and where are its weak points? If we gave people a real analysis of the problem, it would overwhelm them. So we must have a manageable analysis. And it needs to be manageable time-wise, too. I think people can take a 5-year plan. They can take it. So what do we need? We need a national recall movement. A national recall movement. But what is our problem? Our problem is this portion of America that buys Bill O'Reilly's books, that watches Glenn Beck on television, that listens to Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh got a contract from Clear Channel in 2010 for $400 million. $50 million for 8 years. These people, as has been mentioned, cannot stand being looked at. They cannot stand being exposed. We need a manifesto that exposes them. We must expose corporate crime. Because what does corporate crime do? It kills us. 80% of cancer is sociogenic. That's why we have to see our nurses. The air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the chemically engineered food is killing us. But beyond that, think about Bhopal. Think about the Massey Mining Company. 29 deaths in 2010. They didn't take Blankenship, the head. They just gave one of this lower level flunky 3 years. So you killed 29 people, you get 3 years in jail. Something is wrong with the system. Something is wrong with it. So we need to think about an analysis that is manageable and edible, but that has sufficient planks to make fundamental change. We need a single payer plank, yes. We need to define corporate crime, yes. We need to bring back Glass-Steagall, yes. And that's another question. It was Clinton's people. It was Summers and Rubin that killed Glass-Steagall. It was Clinton. It was Clinton that did NAFTA. And the horrible concept is there's a rumor that he may even appoint Larry Summers to be head of the World Bank. The world is looking at us. When Bush was president, there was no place in the world he could go where there were not protests against him. That was not in the American media. He was the most despised political leader in the history of the world. Then all this hope burgeoned out with Obama. We need to take that hope, not depending on Obama, but we need to take that hope and to fashion it into a movement, because America is the evil empire. We are located in the heart of the evil empire. And what we do, if we can do it, will affect the world. Hallelujah.
this session is being filmed by Deep Dish TV. I want to just acknowledge our thanks to them. We still have the need for our own media. We have some of it, but it's fragmented. But it's great that we have had Deep Dish TV around for a very long time. And we're very happy that there's going to be more even at this conference. Strickland took my introduction to our next speaker, but it's okay because I know my next speaker pretty well. Bill Tabb, William Tabb, is an emeritus professor of economics at Queens College and at the Graduate Center. He is also a founder of the Left Forum and its predecessor. He's got a new book, the title of which I hope he'll tell you because I don't have it here anymore. But he's really in many ways been a stalwart of this institution, the Left Forum. And before he came on, when he gave me this thing, time, when I said he's our internal cop, I have bad internal time consciousness. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Bill Tabb.
The theme of this year's Left Forum is inspired by events that took place only a few blocks from here and as far away as Tahrir Square, and are taking place in Greece and Spain and Moscow and all over the world. And we are part of that movement. When we say occupy the system confronting global capitalism, it calls for the kind of historical imagination and searching analysis of the system that we're going to be spending the next 2 days doing. And of course, beyond this conference, we've got a lot of work before us. To occupy the system is first to be aware of the system as a system, and I think that's come through in the speakers who preceded me. A system of unequal privilege and control. To occupy the system requires we occupy the narrative of public debate, which Bill spoke about so well. This is something the Occupy movement has achieved to a remarkable extent, changing the conversation, because what the right has done, it has moved people's attention away from the current crisis, which comes from the deregulation of Wall Street, the greed of the 1%, and says it's the deficit, it's unions, it's public workers, it's people who are on food stamps, and we have a food stamp president. Their ability to do this will continue until there's a force strong enough to tell the truth loudly, boldly, and that is our job. What I want to do is to talk about some of the trends that have been going on and to give some numbers that are important for the American people to understand. The first is that for the last decade, there has been no growth in jobs in this country. There are as many jobs today as there were 10, 11 years ago, but the population has grown. It's grown substantially. There has been no increase in income for the 90%, if not 99%. That we are moving away from the world of the post-war period to an oligarchical system that can only be reversed by a powerful mass movement. Just 1% of the income growth in the last 10 years went to wages. 88% went to corporate profit. Do you have any idea what that means? You do. But Americans have got to pay attention that 93% of the income in 2010, which is the last year we have data for, 93% of all the income increase went to the top 1%. That is the 99% shared 7% of the increased income. This has been going on for a very, very long time. If we consult the CIA World Factbook on the subject of economic inequality, The U.S. is behind Cameroon and the Ivory Coast. We are ahead of Uganda. Partly because of Occupy, the press has done a better job reporting disturbing statistics. A few months ago, the Associated Press reported, squeezed by rising living costs, a record number of Americans, nearly 1 in 2, have fallen into poverty or are scraping by on earnings that classify them as low income. The latest census data depicts a middle class that's shrinking as unemployment stays high and the government safety net frays. The new numbers follow years of stagnating wages for the middle class that has hurt millions of workers and their families. It turns out 97 million Americans fall into the low-income category as earning between 100 and 199% of the poverty level. Some of you are in this room, and millions more are our brothers and sisters in this country. It's not just the current crisis, and it's important to understand that. Not only did total employment not grow, that labor force participation as a result has gone down for every income group. That is, fewer people are in the labor force. They are surviving, they've dropped out, and the only group that is where more people are working in that age category are the over 65s, because they can't afford to retire, that their pensions have been taken away by the corporations, and that they can never retire. And people coming up also with 401ks that they have very little money on will not be able to retire. We are moving backward at a very rapid rate. Things are particularly desperate for minority young people and generally those without a high school degree. For black men, 1 in 3 spend some time in prison, 1 in 3. And for those who don't get a high school degree, 2 in 3. Between 1969 and 2009, the median earnings of men who completed high school but did not go to college fell 47%. So when we look at women and, they're coming up, they're not coming up. They're still getting about 80 cents on the dollar that men are getting. But it's that men's earnings are going down, and they're going down in real terms after inflation at a rapid. So the trend has been bad for decades. From 1973 to 2006, I choose 2006 because that's the year before the current financial crisis began. Productivity, that's output per worker in our country, productivity rose 80%, but real wages grew by less than 1%. That is, it's all going to capital. It is not going to the workers who produce the wealth of our country. This is the reality that has to be made clear to the working class of America, and they have to act on it. This has been going on for decades under Democrats and Republicans. During the Clinton administration in the 1990s, the top 1% got 45% of all the increase of income going to the 100% of us. The 1% got nearly half of it, 45%. Of course, things were better under George W. Bush. The 1% received 73% of all the income growth. These are astounding figures, and they represent a change so that now the richest 1% has more wealth than the bottom 90% of us. They control, they own, and of course it's not the 1%, it's the 1/10 of 1%, the 100th of 1%. It is a ruling class that has grown richer and powerful so that our choices in an election campaign depend on which billionaire is keeping Ron Paul or Newt Gingrich or my favorite, the guy in the sweater vest. Their campaigns are basically, I think it's 22 billionaires and millionaires, multimillionaires, have paid for 60% of the election so far. You're talking about a concentration of wealth and power. Now, what they have done is said, no, the problem is the budget crisis and that Obama's the food stamp president. And it is true that almost 15% of the country now relies on food stamps. 15% of Americans rely on food stamps. It has increased dramatically because people's incomes have fallen. More people are working full-time, 2 and 3 jobs, and still qualify because they're at the poverty level. What is going on is undoing the welfare state, undoing the New Deal, undoing the Great Society, and trying to push us back to a period before progressivism had triumphed. Now, it's interesting. Social Security and Medicare are being challenged, but the Republicans have backed off on cutting them in their budget proposal. They're proposing cutting $6 trillion, which will devastate all the social programs in America. But they're leaving Social Security and Medicare for 10 years. They're doing that because the base of the Republican Party is old, is white, is rich, or richer than the rest of us, and they will fight, keep your hands off our Medicare. They think they're entitled to that. 40% of the labor force, approaching 40% today, are African American, Hispanic, and Asian. That is, our multinational working force is increasingly, and our country will soon be by 2050, majority minority. That is, white folks will be no longer the majority of people in this country. In the workforce, it will be even more so. So you have the situation where the people whose communities are being devastated by these cuts are the ones who are going to support these white folks in their retirement and pay for their health care. It is an interesting phenomenon. The Republican base knows that government workers are disproportionately black because the government has been an equal opportunity employer, and the middle class, the black middle class, is heavily dependent on jobs in the public sector. So not only are programs that are going to help those most in need, which in our racist society are heavily Hispanic blacks, not only the recipients, but the government workers are. And so cutting the budgets, cutting the number of employees, and also cutting the unions, because we now have a situation where there are more union workers working for the government than in the private sector. And so in going after public workers, they're going after the strongest part of the labor movement, which is the strongest part of the organized progressive movement in this country. These are incredibly important developments and changing totally the nature of our society. On the deficit, the government spends 24% of our gross domestic product, but it only collects 15% of our gross domestic product. There is a deficit between 25%, which we spend, heavily military and other things we don't necessarily proud of, but collecting only 15% in tax revenues. This is overwhelmingly because taxes for the rich have been cut, and taxes for corporations have been cut, and equally important, tax avoidance through tax havens is now business as normal, usual, whatever. We know Mitt Romney, when he was forced to release his tax returns, and Americans became acquainted with the use of Swiss banks and the black tax holes in the Caribbean, where Mitt keeps a good bit of his money. He's not alone. That these people do not pay taxes, both because the rate has gone down dramatically and because they avoid it in this way. Citibank alone had over 400 tax haven subsidiaries, 91 in Luxembourg, and another 90 in the Cayman Islands. Well, there, of course, is more to say on all of this, but let me conclude. Only, of course, a left movement that's powerful enough, like the one that was built in the 1930s, under circumstances that are not that different than they are now, It took the people in the 30s a few years to get used to the fact that this was going to go on unless they organized, unless they resisted, unless they demanded change. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is one of the most class-conscious organizations in America, in opposing the New Orleans Living Wage Ordinance, filed an amicus brief with the Supreme Court of Louisiana in which they declared, and I quote, "Living wage proposals are economically unfair because they change the basis on which our economy operates." They, of course, were right. In a similar tone of alarm, Frank Luntz, perhaps the most important Republican strategist alive, told the Republican Governors Association 2 months after Occupy Wall Street took up residence in Zuccotti Park, quote, "I'm so scared of this anti-Wall Street effort. I'm scared to death. They're having an impact on what the American people think of capitalism." He was right. He was right too. And these people are right to be scared. When an outfit called Global Scan began tracking people's views in 2002, 4 in 5 Americans saw the free market as the best system in America for the future, for the world, and all that. This, by the way, was the highest level of support among all countries in the world in which they track opinion. Americans love free enterprise. Support started to fall away and has plummeted, so that now fewer than 3 in 5 Americans see the free market system as the best system for the future. The head of the outfit that does these surveys said, "This is not good news for American business." He too was right. To conclude, the thought behind Occupy the System is that we need to call attention, and this is a point Strickland made, but I want to make it again. Each of our areas of struggle, for quality health care, education, to save the environment, to end the systematic imprisonment and warehousing of black men, to choose full employment and equal opportunity, are all connected. We live in a toxic system that must be confronted in its global dimension. Our problem is not with abuse of the sound system. The problem is the system. The goal and I'll end on this with a quote from a document, it's old, written in 1848 by these 2 guys, is a society in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Solidarity.
Well, with that rousing conclusion, I welcome you to appear again tomorrow morning. We have 2 full days of panels. We have Michael Moore. We have a panel with Francis Fox Piven and Cornel West. We have a number of panels from people in this audience, and I hope you'll enjoy the conference. Thanks a lot.